In this video, we're going to introduce you to the two primary tools for working with your Exchange organization. The first is the Exchange Management Console, or EMC for short. The second is the Exchange Management Shell, or EMS. So starting with the Exchange Management Console, it's important for you to know the four primary interface elements of this console. Now, the console tree is your navigation center. From here, you can work through the various nodes that are part of this console tree. For example, there's the organization configuration node, the server configuration node, recipient configuration, and then there's a toolbox. Now, we're going to take a look at this in a moment, but all of that is grouped under the console tree. Next, we have the result pane, which provides additional objects that are connected to the node that you've selected. Then you have the work pane, which only appears if you're working with objects that relate to the mailbox server role. So whether you've selected the mailbox role under organization configuration or server configuration, you'll see in that case that there's a results pane as well as a work pane. And finally, we have the action pane. This provides a list of actions that you can perform based on the object that's selected. So now that you have a good understanding of all of the pane possibilities involved, and by pane I don't mean P-A-I-N, I mean P-A-N-E, of course. Well, now that you can see all of that, now let's take a look at our Exchange server, which is NY-EX2K10-1, and let's see how all of this really comes into play when we're working with the real Exchange Management Console. So here we are on our New York Exchange server, which we installed in a previous lesson, and we're looking at the Exchange Management Console. So here we can see the console tree, and you can see the various nodes like organization configuration, server configuration, recipient configuration, and then the toolbox. And again, you can see how the results pane changes here, as well as the actions pane depending on what we've selected. But in certain circumstances, for example, when we select mailbox under server configuration, or if we select mailbox under organization configuration, you can see that we have a results pane here, and we have our work pane here. In addition, depending on what we've selected, the actions pane changes quite a bit. So here we see organization configuration, and we see 4 out of the 5 server roles. Now you might be wondering, well, what happened to the Edge Transport server? If you recall, the Edge Transport server cannot reside on the same system as the other server roles. It has to sit all on its own out in the DMZ or the perimeter network. Now that doesn't change the tools that you use to manage an Edge Transport server. You will still have an Exchange Management Console and an Exchange Management Shell. However, with the console, instead of seeing all of these server roles in the console, you'll just see the Edge Transport server role. Some of these settings are pretty intuitive. For example, organization configuration. Obviously, everything we do here is designed to be organization-wide. As opposed to server configuration, anything we do here is something that relates specifically to a server. So when you have multiple Exchange servers and you want to make a change to one specific server, that would be logically handled here. But here you can see Mailbox Settings under Organization Configuration node includes a ton of different settings and tabs: database management, database availability groups, sharing policies, and as we click through these, you can see that the Exchange Management Console is a very easy way to work when it comes to finding what you need. So you can select any one of these, and then you can use the Actions pane over here on the right in order to find the various wizards that you can use through the Exchange Management Console. Now, the Actions pane takes some getting used to. In times past, if we wanted to know what we could do, we always right-clicked, and it would tell us. But here you can see that instead of right-clicking, it shows us here in the Actions pane exactly what we can do down here. It also shows us from the mailbox part of the organization configuration node what we can do at that level as well. So if we right-click mailbox itself, notice these options here relate directly to these options here. But if you're not comfortable with the Actions pane and you don't want to become comfortable with it, that's completely up to you. You can actually turn it off right here, by selecting Show Hide Action Pane. And you notice that now you have a little bit more real estate room on your desktop for managing your Exchange environment. Personally, I like to leave it on, although I have to admit I do find myself from time to time right-clicking in order to find my options. But that's just an old habit that's taking a while to die there. Now, in terms of the console tree, you can click Show Hide Console Tree as well, although for the life of me I have no idea why you would want to do that. I always leave my console tree on so that I can see exactly what I'm working with. So again, if we go from Mailbox to Client Access, you can see in this case we don't have too much here we can configure. We have Outlook Web App Mailbox Policies, Exchange ActiveSync Mailbox Policies. Under Hub Transport, you have Send Connectors, Remote Domains, Accepted Domains, Edge Subscriptions, and a variety of other options like Transport Rules and Journal Rules. Unified Messaging. For those of you who are familiar with Exchange 2007, you can see that the Unified Messaging tabs here have not changed at all. You have dial plans, IP gateways, auto attendance, and mailbox policies. Under Server Configuration, you'll note that Mailbox has a little bit less to work with. Up here in the Organization Configuration, there were a variety of different tabs, but here you can see that we're working with the Exchange server itself, the one that we've installed, and here we see the database copy down here. Under Client Access, you see we have Outlook Web App, Exchange Control Panel, Exchange ActiveSync, POP3 and IMAP4, and the Offline Address Book Distribution. Under Hub Transport, there are only receive connectors that we can configure here on the server level. And then under Unified Messaging, there's really not much that we can configure here. Recipient Configuration shows us all of the different recipients that we have, and we're going to talk about these in a future lesson. But we have Mailbox, Distribution Group, Mail Contact, Disconnected Mailbox, and Move Request. And then last but not least, we have the Toolbox. The Toolbox is a collection of tools that can help us when it comes to configuration management. For example, the Best Practices Analyzer. This is a great tool. Here's the Public Folder Management Console, another wonderful tool that we have in Exchange 2010. We have the Remote Connectivity Analyzer. Looking down under Mail Flow Tools, you can see Mail Flow Troubleshooter, the Message Tracking Tool, Queue Viewer. Under Performance Tools, we have Performance Monitor, we have Performance Troubleshooter. So now that we've learned quite a bit about the Exchange Management Console, and you'll see that we're going to work with this quite a bit in the videos to follow, let's go back to our slides and learn a little bit more about the Exchange Management Shell. The Exchange Management Shell is built upon PowerShell. Now, for those of you who know what PowerShell is, your first thought might be, oh no, what are they doing to me here? I don't want to manage my Exchange from a command line. Well, the goal going forward for those of you who know what PowerShell is to put you at ease, to help you to appreciate that the Exchange Management Console is always there for you to work with. You can do 99.9% of what you need in the Exchange Management Console. However, if you really want to learn Exchange at the highest levels, you're going to have to learn a little bit about PowerShell. Now, for those of you who don't already have an impression, your question is, what is PowerShell? PowerShell is both a command line tool and an automated scripting platform. Now, if you've done some reading about PowerShell, much of the press has reported misconceptions about the purpose of PowerShell. It isn't a replacement for command.exe, and that's obvious by the fact that when you look at your server still contains command.exe. It includes both for a reason. Think about it in terms of your desktop. Here you have Notepad, you have WordPad, you might have even installed Word 2007 or 2010, or some other OpenOffice Word application. Whatever the case, there are multiple tools for doing different things. And so sometimes you may reach out to Notepad to do something, as opposed to reaching out to something a little more powerful like Word. The same is true when it comes to having a command.exe, where as an administrator you may reach out and grab that in order to quickly get an IP address of a system or ping another system. As opposed to PowerShell, which is so much more powerful. It's an automation scripting platform with multiple APIs that are accessible to the PowerShell command line interface. And after you work with it for a little bit, you're going to find that it's actually pretty exciting. Now, Exchange 2010 requires PowerShell version 2. PowerShell has commands that are built using Commandlets. So your next question is going to be, what are Commandlets? Well, Commandlets follow a simple verb-noun structure. Some of the common verbs are things like get, set, remove, test, enable, disable, install, uninstall, new, and move. So as we move forward here and you see some of the demonstrations, you're going to see these verbs come up pretty often. And then the second half of the structure is a noun. For example, get-service. Well, that's a commandlet that will get the services that are on your system. If you type that in and you don't provide any other parameters, it will return to you the services on your system. Now you might say, okay, well that's great, but what can I do with that? Well, typically you use the get command to gather information, and then you string that command together with something like a set command, which will then do something with the services that you've gathered. In order to string these together, we use a pipeline, which you can see here. Now the pipeline on a keyboard is typically located right above your backspace key. And what you do is you use that in order to take information from one commandlet and pipe it through to another. So you might start thinking about pipelines and thinking, okay, like the Alaskan pipeline. But no, actually that's a bad example, because the Alaskan pipeline, typically oil is put into it and at the other end oil comes out of it. As you can see, I don't know really anything about the Alaskan pipeline. But essentially with pipelines of that sort, what goes in is what comes out. Nothing changes in between. But when we're talking about a pipeline with commandlets, we're actually thinking more along the lines of an assembly line. Typically with, let's say, an automobile assembly line, you have various pieces that eventually come together to form one vehicle at the end. And so pipelines work a little bit more like an assembly line in that you start off with getting information, and then as you move forward, you can actually manipulate that information by adding pipelines to it. You'll find that with one line in PowerShell, you can accomplish so many things that would have taken multiple lines of code or a very long script or string prior to working with PowerShell. Okay, so you have the foundation here. We're going to now take a look at PowerShell, and we're going to then move into the Exchange Management Shell so you can see how the two are different. And so we're going to go back to our New York Exchange server. Okay, so we're back on our Exchange 2010 server, and even though we may feel more comfortable working with a screen like this, the Exchange Management Console here, being that the Exchange Management Shell is an alternative tool provided, and in some cases it may be the only tool that you can use to accomplish a certain task, well, you have to get more comfortable with it. But before we open up the Exchange Management Shell, why don't we take a little bit of a look at PowerShell itself, because that may help you to ease into the Exchange Management Shell experience. So you'll notice that there's a PowerShell icon right here on the taskbar. If we select that, it opens up our Windows PowerShell. Now you can see that's not really too scary, is it? In fact, it looks just like a command prompt. If we click the Start button down here and we click Command Prompt, look at that. How different are they really? But being that we've already talked about the power behind PowerShell, you're aware that PowerShell has a bit more to it than what the command prompt can offer. But to help you feel more comfortable to start with, let's take a couple of very simple commands that we would normally type right in the command prompt. For example, as network administrators, how often is it we go to a system, we open up a command prompt, and we type in ipconfig just to get some information about that system? Well, you'll notice here, aside from a nice blue background, there's no difference in the actual display of information from within PowerShell than it would be from within the command.exe. Now you might say, well, what about all of those commandlets you were talking about? Obviously, that's going to take some time to learn about and work with. Well, it's true, but keeping in mind the verb-noun structure of a commandlet, it's good to know that there's really only a handful of different commandlets you might start with. So let's say you wanted to start with the get commandlet, and you're thinking, I don't know what to get. I know I have an idea of what I want, but I'm not exactly sure. Well, if you hit the Tab key, notice that it starts to fill in some of the items in alphabetical order that you may want to get. So this can be very helpful. Hitting that tab key can really show you that even though you may not know exactly what you're looking to get, it will help you to find the noun side to that commandlet. Now, in this case, let's say we want some help. So we type get help. And right here, this is probably one of the first things you want to read when it comes to PowerShell, and that is the help information. Because this shows you how you would go about getting help, especially help about specific commands. For example, there's a commandlet called get process. Now, I'd like to know more about that. If I type get help, get process, as you can see there, and I hit enter, notice it gives me the information I need specifically about the get process commandlet. It shows me the syntax, the description, related links, various remarks which include examples, so you can see how working with PowerShell itself may not be too overwhelming due to the fact that there's such a great help system in place. Okay, now you've seen the Windows PowerShell view of things. Now you're probably concerned, what am I in for with the Exchange Management Shell? Well, if we click the Start button again, and we go to our Exchange Server Exchange Management Shell option right here, there are a few things you want to take note of right away. It starts off with a welcome. Welcome to the Exchange Management Shell. The Exchange team knew that this was going to be a bit of an ordeal for individuals, getting used to this, getting used to the command line. So look what they do. They provide information on how to find a full list of commandlets by using the get-command, a full list of only Exchange commandlets by using the get-x command, and then you're provided additional information about finding what you need. But you'll notice it gives you a tip of the day. Tip of the day number 17. Sometimes it's useful to convert the output of a commandlet to a string to interoperate with native commandlets. For example, and then it gives the example of how you could output a commandlet to a string. Now, you'll notice a couple of things here. You'll notice that it said it was connecting and then connected to the New York-EX2K10-1.globalmantics.com server. During this connection process, what happens is Exchange checks to see, first of all, if you're allowed to connect, and then if you are allowed to connect, if your user account has the permissions that allows you to connect, Exchange will take a look at what RBAC management roles you've been assigned. Now that stands for Role-Based Access Control. We're going to be looking at how Exchange manages permissions and what control settings are afforded to each Exchange administrator. In this case, we're logged in as the Uber administrator. Pretty much we can do anything we want. However, let's say you have individuals that you'd like to give them access to the Exchange Management Shell and give them a little bit of work that they can do, but not too much. Well, again, that's where Role-Based Access Control, RBAC, will come into play, so that that individual may still be able to open up the Exchange Management Shell, but can only do so much with it. So just in case you're wondering, well, what makes this any different from PowerShell itself? Why is this different, aside from the lack of the blue background? Well, in actuality, what happens is there's an Exchange snap-in that kicks in when you open the Exchange Management Shell. And that snap-in allows you to have access to a variety of additional commandlets. Now, if you open up PowerShell, you will not have any of the Exchange commandlets that you really want. So your Exchange Management Shell is PowerShell, but it includes those Exchange commandlets because that's what a snap-in is. It's a collection of commandlets that are used to administer a specific application or a major component. So if these weren't loaded, if you were working in PowerShell itself, you could load the snap-in yourself. But this is just much easier, that the Exchange Management Shell will do the work for you, will load the snap-ins, will connect up to the Exchange server. It's all done for you through the Exchange Management Shell. So what would we like to do first here? Well, if we type in get x command, that shows you very quickly all of the different commandlets that relate to Exchange. Again, that was not meant to scare you, just to show you really all of the tools that are at your disposal. So if we scroll up here, you can see there are a lot of different test commandlets, certainly plenty of set commandlets, which is sort of the sidekick commandlet to the get commandlet. Typically you get something and then you set something. get it, set it, and forget it. That's sort of the idea, but it doesn't always work that way, does it? So here we have the various commandlets that you can see. You can scroll through these and see how they work. And now if we just clear the screen here, we have a mailbox that was created. Aside from the administrator mailbox, I created this one for Susan Baker. Her alias is S. Baker. Now Susan's a new employee, so she got her first mailbox on the Exchange server because we haven't moved over the other accounts just yet. Let's see what we can find out about Susan's mailbox. If we type in get mailbox, and we don't put an identity, we don't actually indicate an individual, if we just hit enter, notice what it does. It returns to us information about the various mailboxes that exist on the system. So here you see administrator, you see Susan Baker, you see the alias, you see the server name, and you see that there's a prohibit send quota. In the case of Susan, it's unlimited at this time. Now what if we wanted to find out information just about Susan Baker? Well, if we type get mailbox and we type in Susan Baker, notice we get that same information, but this time it's only about Susan herself. Okay, so we know how to get Susan Baker's mailbox, but what about that prohibit send quota? Well, if we hit the up arrow, here it gets us her mailbox again. And now we're going to use one of those pipelines that we talked about, and we're going to set the mailbox, and we're going to use the prohibit send quota. And let's just give her something like 20 megabytes and hit enter. Okay, so it looks like it worked, but how do we know if it did? If we hit the up arrow twice, we go back to get mailbox Susan Baker. And now notice we see Susan Baker, we see the alias, the server name, and we see the prohibit send quota has been changed. Again, the nice thing here is that you can use get and set to work together to get more than just one mailbox, but to get a collection of mailboxes and set those mailboxes with a quick line that groups those commandlets together with a pipeline. You can change the settings all with one line, as opposed to going through the Exchange Management Console and making all those changes through the GUI, which will take you considerably longer. What are some other starter commandlets we might look at? Well, we might take a look at using the get Exchange server commandlet. In this case, we only have the one server. So there's the server, and notice what it tells us. It tells us the name of our server, it tells us the site, it tells us the server roles, the edition, and the admin display version. One of my favorite set of commandlets are the test commandlets. So if we type in test, and we hit a dash there, and we hit the tab key, notice we can find the exact test we'd like to run. So let's say we'd like to test Mappy connectivity. If we hit enter here, here we see a successful result. Let's test some other things. We can test the service health. We can test the system health. Let's try that one. And we receive a very interesting reply. It mentions that it appears to be running as a virtual machine. Please review the support policy detailed in Microsoft Knowledge Base article, and it gives the article itself. So you can see that by running tests of this sort, this can be very helpful in terms of finding information about your system and then being able to use that information along with the Microsoft Knowledge Base article links that are provided to either change something that is an error, or in this case a warning, just to make sure that we're following best practice in terms of what Microsoft supports and what we're doing. So hopefully you're starting to see the real value here in the Exchange Management Shell. Now, there's one other thing I'd like to show you, and that's because sometimes we may feel like the learning curve is just too great. There's no way I'm going to be able to learn all of these different commandlets and things. I might become a PowerShell novice, maybe an Exchange Management Shell novice, but I'm never going to really know how to use this to realistically master the Exchange Management Shell. But one of the really cool things that are provided for us, if we go back to the Exchange Management Console, And if we just do something here, like let's create a new mailbox. Okay, and so I know we're jumping a little bit ahead here, but it's important not to focus so much on what we're doing right now, but on what help is provided through the various wizards to help us to learn the Exchange Management Shell. So here we have User Mailbox. We click Next, and we're going to create a new user in the process. So we'll start by typing in the user's name. We'll click Next. We'll provide an alias. And we're just going to blow through this because I don't want you to get too tied up in the wizard itself on how to create a new mailbox. More importantly, let's look at this screen here. It's a configuration summary of what we've just done. Now you notice here it says to copy the contents of this page, press Control-C. So if we hit Control-C, what does that give us? Well, if we hit Control-C, it will copy this information. But if we just click New, notice what happens. It actually shows us underneath John Smith here, it shows we completed creating that account, and then it says the Exchange Management Shell command completed. So actually what we're doing within the Exchange Management console, behind the scenes, there's actually a PowerShell commandlet that's launched. In this case, notice it says new-mailbox. That's the original commandlet that's used. And then, of course, there's all of these additional parameters that are used with it. Look at how long this is, though. This could be where you get overwhelmed. But again, we can press Control-C, and that gives us the information here. Now, if we open up something like, let's just say Notepad, notice it gives us the information on the page, and it gives us the commandlet here. So we can use that in a couple of different ways. We can use that to study up on how this commandlet worked. We can make changes to that commandlet, and then in the future, if we wanted to create an account that was exactly like this account in terms of all of the settings, we can just change that information and pop it right into the Exchange Management Shell. The command would go forward, and so you can see how once you really start to feel comfortable with the Exchange Management Shell, we could have created this user account in a couple of clicks, as opposed to going through all of the work that was involved in the new Mailbox wizard. And this is just one wizard. Imagine once you get more comfortable with the shell, how much more work you can accomplish, how much easier managing Exchange will become for you. Work with it as much as you possibly can, because PowerShell is not only used here with Exchange, but it's now becoming more and more a part of all of the Microsoft applications. As a modern-day Windows administrator, there's really no way to avoid working with PowerShell.